What's good, history fam? Before we dive into today's absolutely unhinged medieval murder mystery, smash that like button if you're ready for some royal tea that's hotter than a witch burning. Hit subscribe and ring that notification bell because we're about to uncover a conspiracy so twisted it makes Game of Thrones look like Sesame Street. Today we're traveling back to 1356 Korea, not for K-pop, not for kimchi, but for something way more sinister. Picture this: a barren queen, jealous concubines, dead babies, and a revenge plot that took 18 years to execute. This is the story of how a group of medieval baby mamas orchestrated one of the most psychological horror shows in Asian royal history. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll never look at palace dramas the same way again. So grab your favorite snack, get comfortable, because we're about to spend the next 3 hours in the blood-soaked halls of the Goryeo dynasty. Let's get into it. The nightmare begins. Our story begins in the royal palace of Gaejeong. That's modern-day North Korea. Folks, where King Gongmin rules over a kingdom that's basically the medieval equivalent of a failed state. We're talking about a place where the walls literally have ears, where your breakfast could be your last meal, and where jealousy doesn't just break hearts. It breaks necks. But here's where it gets dark, and I mean Stephen King dark. King Gongmin and his wife Princess Noguk were madly in love with each other. But the couple had no child for over 10 years. In medieval Asia, that's not just unfortunate, that's a death sentence for a queen. I want you to really visualize this because it's straight out of a psychological thriller. Every night, Queen Noguk would walk through the palace halls, and she'd hear it. The sound that haunted her dreams. Babies crying. Not just any babies, his babies. The king's bastard children. Living reminders of her own empty womb. Despite suggestions of taking a second wife, King Gongmin ignored these requests. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. He didn't ignore the concubines. Let me break this down in terms y'all can relate to. Think of Queen Noguk as Melania Trump, but with actual political power. King Gongmin? He's like a billionaire CEO who publicly says he's faithful, but keeps a whole floor of his company for his personal assistants. And the concubines? They're not just side chicks. They're Ivy League educated, multilingual, strategic thinkers who got pregnant and now they want everything. This isn't just some medieval soap opera, folks. This is American corporate culture with swords. Queen Noguk, real name Borjigin Budashiri, because apparently medieval names were as extra as she was. She was a Yuan dynasty imperial family member as the great-granddaughter of Dharmabala. Translation: this woman had connections that could literally end civilizations. Imagine if your ex-wife's uncle was Vladimir Putin. That's the energy we're dealing with. But here's what makes this truly horrifying. She wasn't just powerful. She was smart. And smart, jealous women with unlimited resources and political immunity. That's a horror movie waiting to happen. Lady on the concubine with the biggest target on her back. Why? Because her son looked exactly like the king. And in a world where paternity tests didn't exist, facial resemblance was everything. Lady Hong and Lady Bei, the supporting cast in our royal horror show. Think of them as the best friends who enable the main character's descent into madness. Here's where our story takes a turn from palace drama to straight-up horror movie. September 17th, 1356. Lady Bei's infant son, let's call him baby number 1, is found dead in his crib. But this wasn't SIDS, folks. This wasn't some tragic accident. The crib looked like it had been attacked by a wild animal. Scratch marks, burn marks, blood. Someone had tried to cover up the sabotage with fire, but medieval CSI was surprisingly good at their job. And who was the last person seen near the nursery? Our dear Queen Noguk, claiming she was there to inspect the drapes. At 2 a.m. in a nursery. For drapes. Sure, January. That's totally normal behavior. What makes this story truly terrifying isn't just the murder. It's the slow psychological deterioration of everyone involved. Imagine living in a place where your own children aren't safe, where the woman who smiles at you during dinner might poison your baby's milk the next morning. The concubines started having nightmares. Palace servants reported hearing screaming from the women's quarters, not arguments, but pure, primal terror. These women were living in a real-life horror movie, and they knew the killer lived right down the hall. Now, here's where our medieval thriller transforms into something straight out of The Craft meets House of Cards. The surviving concubines, Lady On, Lady Hong, and 3 others whose names were literally erased from history, suspicious much. They start meeting in secret. But these weren't your typical girl talk sessions. These women were political hostages turned mothers turned potential murder victims, and they were done playing nice. Picture this scene. 5 women, dressed in silk robes, sitting in a circle by candlelight in a hidden chamber beneath the palace. They're not just planning a murder, they're planning the systematic destruction of a queen, her bloodline, and her political influence. Lady On, the ringleader, had connections throughout the palace. Servants, guards, even some of the king's advisors owed her favors. Why? Because before she became a concubine, she was a diplomat's daughter who spoke 5 languages and had memorized the genealogies of every major noble family in Korea. In modern terms, she was basically a walking Wikipedia with a grudge and access to medieval weapons. Let me paint you a picture that'll make this hit different. Imagine Amazon, but instead of Jeff Bezos, it's run by a king. Queen Noguk is like the barren CEO's wife who sits on the board and makes everyone's life miserable. The concubines? They're the brilliant female executives who got pregnant by the boss and now they're being systematically pushed out of the company. But instead of wrongful termination lawsuits, we're dealing with actual termination, the permanent kind. This is basically Succession with medieval Korean characteristics, except instead of Logan Roy, we've got Kim Gong-min, and instead of shareholders, we've got concubines plotting literal murder. Here's where things get really dark. The concubines didn't just want Queen Noguk dead. They wanted her to suffer the same psychological torture she'd put them through. The plan was diabolical. 1. Phase 1. Make the queen paranoid by moving things in her room, changing her schedule without telling her, having servants forget her orders. 2. Phase 2. Start rumors that SHE was the one who was barren by choice, that she was secretly using medieval birth control because she didn't want to ruin her figure. 3. Phase 3. The poisoning. But not just any poison. They chose foxglove, which causes hallucinations before death. They wanted her final moments to be filled with the same nightmares she'd given them. Remember how I said these women were smart? Well, apparently medieval chemistry wasn't their strong suit. Lady Hong, who was in charge of the poisoning, got the dosage completely wrong. Instead of killing Queen Noguk, the foxglove just made her violently constipated for 4 days straight. 4 days. The palace doctor's prescription? Fermented radish and leeches. which honestly would make anyone homicidal. But here's the terrifying part. During those 4 days of intestinal distress, Queen Noguk became convinced that someone was trying to kill her. And she was right. This wasn't paranoia. This was survival instinct. Queen Noguk's revenge was swift and brutal. She couldn't prove who poisoned her, but she didn't need proof. She had power. Within a week, 2 of the concubines' remaining children were found dead. Not murdered, that would be too obvious. These kids just got sick. Mysterious illnesses that the palace doctors couldn't identify or treat. But Lady An knew. They all knew. The queen was picking them off one by one, and she was enjoying it. This is like if The Handmaid's Tale had a baby with American Horror Story, Coven. You've got fertile women being systematically eliminated by a barren authority figure. But instead of a dystopian future, it's medieval Korea, and instead of ceremonial robes, everyone's wearing silk and carrying concealed daggers. The psychological warfare, the systematic elimination of threats, the way power corrupts absolutely. This story has themes that are more relevant today than they were 700 years ago. Think about modern politics. Think about corporate boardrooms. Think about any situation where powerful people with resources decide that human lives are acceptable collateral damage for their personal goals. Now, here's where our story takes a turn that nobody, and I mean nobody, saw coming. A palace eunuch named Kim Yong-soo, yes, his name literally meant dragon tree. Medieval Koreans did not mess around with names, was doing his rounds near the women's quarters when he heard something that made his blood run cold. The concubines weren't just planning the queen's murder anymore. They were rehearsing, like some twisted medieval theater production. They were practicing their fake grief for when the queen died. But that's not the part that'll keep you up at night. The eunuch overheard them discussing something called the exchange. Here's where this story becomes absolutely insane. The concubines weren't just planning to kill the queen. They were planning to replace her potential heir with one of their own sons. Think about this logically. If Queen Noguk died before producing an heir, the kingdom would need a successor. Queen Noguk and King Gongmin were childless for 15 years of marriage until she became pregnant and died in 1365 from complications in childbirth. But what if, hypothetically, she had given birth to a son right before her death? The concubines' plan was to have one of their children discovered as the queen's secret baby. Medieval DNA testing wasn't exactly available, and if the right people vouched for the child's legitimacy, this wasn't just murder, folks. This was a medieval coup disguised as a succession crisis. Imagine if during a presidential election, a group of people not only assassinated one candidate but also installed a completely fake heir to their political dynasty. That's the scale of what these women were attempting. We're talking about changing the entire future of a kingdom through strategic murder and identity fraud. This makes Watergate look like a parking ticket. But Queen Noguk wasn't just sitting around waiting to be murdered. She had her own network of spies, and what she discovered about the concubines' plan drove her to a level of paranoia that was both rational and terrifying. She started testing everyone. Servants would find their food pre-tasted by the queen herself. She began sleeping in different rooms every night, never telling anyone in advance where she'd be. She had her own food prepared by servants who were watched by other servants who were watched by guards who reported directly to her. This woman was living in a state of constant psychological warfare, and it was breaking her mind. Here's where the story gets even more twisted. The concubines, realizing their poisoning plan had failed, decided to frame the queen for her own attempted murder. Stay with me here because this is diabolical. They planted evidence in the queen's chambers that SHE was planning to poison herself and blame it on them, thereby justifying executing all the concubines and their children. It was a double reverse psychology murder plot that would make Agatha Christie proud. But the evidence was too perfect, too convenient, and Queen Noguk was smart enough to realize that if someone wanted to frame her, they'd probably make it obvious enough for the king to discover. King Gongmin was caught in an impossible situation. He loved his wife, but he also loved his children, all of his children, including the illegitimate ones. He couldn't execute the concubines without proof, but he couldn't ignore the mounting evidence that someone was trying to murder someone. The king was also known to have entered into pederastic relationships with several court catamites, which meant his attention was divided between his wife, his concubines, and his male lovers. This man was trying to manage more relationship drama than a reality TV show while running a kingdom that was basically falling apart. Think of King Gongmin as the CEO of a major tech company who's married to the daughter of a foreign investor, Queen Noguk, has several vice presidents he's having affairs with, the concubines, and is also secretly involved with some male board members. Meanwhile, the company is hemorrhaging money, there are hostile takeover attempts, and everyone is trying to assassinate everyone else, literally or figuratively. This is Elon Musk's Twitter takeover, but with actual murder. In December 1356, 3 months after baby number one's murder, the eunuch Kim Yong-soo made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden in Lady On's chambers, behind a false wall that had been covered with silk tapestries, he found a collection of items that told the real story. Detailed floor plans of the royal nursery, or a schedule of the Queen's daily activities for the past 6 months, of vials of various substances, later identified as different types of poison, and most damning of all, a child's royal seal, carved with the name of a prince who didn't exist yet. They weren't just planning the Queen's murder. They were planning to install a completely fabricated royal dynasty. Testimony from wet nurses who had been dismissed immediately after royal children died. Financial records showing that Queen Noguk had been making suspicious payments to palace staff. And most damning of all, a confession from a dying servant who claimed he had been ordered to tamper with cribs and baby food. This trial had all the elements of modern conspiracy cases. You had circumstantial evidence, conflicting testimony, political motivations, and the fundamental question: at what point does self-defense become aggression? Think about modern cases where people have been charged with terrorism for planning attacks against what they claim are oppressive government systems. The legal and moral questions are identical. When is violence justified, and who gets to decide? After 3 days of testimony, the judges reached a verdict that shocked everyone in the courtroom. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty of treason, but not guilty of murder in the first degree. The reasoning? The judges accepted the argument that the concubines had been acting to protect royal children from what they genuinely believed was a murderous queen. Their methods were illegal, but their motivations were patriotic. It was basically medieval jury nullification. Instead of immediate execution, the concubines were sentenced to exile. They would be banished from the kingdom, their children would be removed from the line of succession, and they would never be allowed to return. But here's where the story takes its most horrific turn. Queen Noguk refused to accept the sentence. Using her connections to the Yuan dynasty, Queen Noguk essentially threatened to trigger an international incident if the concubines weren't executed. She was a Yuan dynasty imperial family member as the great-granddaughter of Dharmabala, which meant that insulting her was tantamount to insulting the Mongol Empire. King Gongmin was forced to choose between his kingdom's independence and his former lovers' lives. He chose the kingdom. The execution was scheduled for dawn on March 15, 1357. But what happened that morning became the stuff of legend and nightmare. Lady An was executed first. As she was led to the executioner's block, she made one final statement that was recorded by multiple witnesses. "My son will remember, and he will return." It wasn't a plea for mercy. It was a promise of revenge. The most disturbing part of this entire story is what happened to the children. The concubines' sons and daughters, some as young as 3 years old, were present at their mother's executions. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was psychological warfare. Queen Noguk wanted these children to witness what happened to people who challenged royal authority. She wanted them to be traumatized into submission. But trauma doesn't always create submission. Sometimes it creates something much more dangerous. What Queen Noguk did to those children is what we would now recognize as deliberate psychological abuse designed to create complex PTSD. She was essentially programming these kids to be afraid of authority figures for the rest of their lives. But psychological trauma can also create an opposite reaction, an obsessive need for revenge that can last decades. Think about modern stories of children who witness their parents' murders and spend their entire adult lives seeking justice. Think about generational trauma and how it manifests in families and communities. Queen Noguk thought she was ending a threat to her power. What she actually did was create a new generation of enemies who would have nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Here's where our medieval horror story becomes a generational saga that makes The Godfather look like a children's book. After her death, King Gongmin lost interest in politics when Queen Noguk died in 1365. But the children of the executed concubines? They were just getting started. Lady An's son, who witnessed his mother's execution when he was 4 years old, was smuggled out of the kingdom by loyal servants. He was raised in secret by a network of exiled nobles who had opposed Queen Noguk's reign of terror. But they didn't just raise him, they trained him. For 18 years, this kid, let's call him Prince Shadow because his real name was erased from most historical records, was educated in military strategy, court politics, languages, and most importantly, he was taught exactly why his mother had died. Think of it as a medieval version of Kill Bill. A child raised for one purpose: to destroy everyone responsible for his mother's death. But here's what makes this story truly terrifying. He was good at it. Really, really good. In 1374, 17 years after his mother's execution, Prince Shadow returned to Korea, not as a refugee or a beggar, but as a military commander in the service of a rival political faction. Gongmin was eventually killed in his sleep in 1374 by conspirators led by Cho Man-seng. But what the history books don't mention is that one of those conspirators was a young man whose identity nobody questioned because everyone who might have recognized him was already dead. This is like if someone murdered your entire family when you were a child, and then 20 years later you came back as a Navy SEAL with a law degree and unlimited financial resources. Except instead of modern legal systems, you're dealing with medieval justice, which basically meant whoever has the most swords wins. Think about modern stories of organized crime families, where revenge plots can span decades and involve multiple generations. This is that energy, but with royal bloodlines and international political implications. Prince Shadow didn't just assassinate the king. That would have been too simple, too merciful. Instead, he systematically destroyed everyone who had been involved in his mother's trial and execution. Palace guards who had arrested the concubines, mysterious accidents, judges who had sentenced them to death, sudden illnesses, servants who had testified against them, unexplained disappearances, and Queen Noguk's relatives. They found themselves facing trumped-up charges, losing their lands, being exiled or executed for crimes that were probably fabricated. This wasn't just revenge. This was medieval ethnic cleansing disguised as political reform. What makes this story truly chilling is that Prince Shadow's revenge was completely legal and totally justified according to the political systems of his time. He never committed murder. He just ensured that people who had committed crimes against his family were brought to justice through proper legal channels. The fact that those legal channels were corrupt and could be manipulated by someone with enough resources and patience, that was just medieval politics. This is basically what happens when someone with unlimited resources and a deep understanding of legal loopholes decides to destroy their enemies through the court system rather than through violence. Think about modern cases where wealthy individuals have used strategic lawsuits, regulatory capture, and political influence to destroy their opponents completely legally. The methods are different, but the principle is identical. Here's the part that'll give you nightmares about the nature of justice and revenge. In 1380, 6 years after the king's assassination, Prince Shadow was finally identified by a palace eunuch who had been present at his mother's execution. Instead of fleeing or fighting, he did something that nobody expected. He confessed to everything, but his confession wasn't an admission of guilt. It was a detailed legal argument about why everything he had done was justified under Korean law and traditional concepts of filial duty. The trial became even more infamous than his mother's, because unlike the Concubines trial, which had been about treason and murder, this trial was about the fundamental nature of justice itself. Prince Shadow's defense was simple. He had honored his mother by seeking justice for her wrongful death. Every person he had targeted had been guilty of crimes against the royal family. Every action he had taken had been legal under the laws of the kingdom. The prosecution's counter-argument was equally simple. Legal doesn't mean moral, and systematic revenge, even if justified, undermines the stability of society. The judges reached a decision that would influence Korean legal philosophy for centuries. Prince Shadow was guilty of conspiracy, but his actions were deemed righteous revenge, a concept that had never been formally recognized in Korean law before. His sentence? Exile, but with full honors. He would be banished from the kingdom, but he would retain his military rank and be granted lands in a neighboring territory. It was essentially the medieval equivalent of a plea bargain with witness protection. But here's where our story reaches its most disturbing conclusion. Prince Shadow's case established a legal precedent that would be used to justify political violence for the next 2 centuries. The concept of righteous revenge became a loophole that allowed powerful families to settle scores through what was technically legal violence. If you could prove that your family had been wronged by another family, you could seek justice through methods that would otherwise be considered murder. Medieval Korea had accidentally legalized blood feuds. This is basically what happens when self-defense laws are written too broadly. The intention is to protect people who are genuinely defending themselves, but the practical effect is to create legal loopholes that can be exploited by people seeking revenge. Think about modern stand-your-ground laws, where the definition of self-defense has been expanded to cover situations that are essentially premeditated violence. The legal reasoning is identical. If you can argue that your actions were defensive rather than aggressive, you can get away with almost anything. The other children of the executed concubines, Lady Hong's daughter, Lady Bei's surviving son, and 3 others, also survived to adulthood, and they also sought revenge. But their methods were different. Instead of military conquest, they chose infiltration. They became palace servants, court officials, diplomatic attaches, positions that gave them access to sensitive information and influential people. For 30 years, they systematically leaked state secrets, sabotaged military campaigns, and provided intelligence to Korea's enemies. They were like a medieval spy network dedicated to bringing down the dynasty that had killed their mothers. By 1392, the Goryeo dynasty had fallen and been replaced by the Joseon dynasty. While historians usually attribute this to political and economic factors, there's compelling evidence that the children of the concubines played a significant role in destabilizing the government from within. They didn't just seek revenge against individual people. They sought revenge against the entire system that had enabled their mother's murders. Here's the most chilling part of this entire story. The concubines' children succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Not only did they destroy everyone responsible for their mother's deaths, they helped bring down the entire dynasty. Every person who had participated in the trial, every noble family that had supported Queen Noguk, every institution that had enabled the executions, all of it was swept away in the political revolution of 1392. The children of the concubines lived to see their enemies' children become refugees, exiles, and casualties of war. They got to watch the families that had destroyed their families experience the same trauma, the same loss, the same desperate fear. It was revenge on a generational scale, and it was absolutely complete. So what's the takeaway from this medieval horror story? What can we learn from a 700-year-old tale of jealousy, murder, and generational revenge? First, power without accountability always leads to atrocity. Queen Noguk wasn't evil because she was cruel. She was cruel because she had the power to be cruel without consequences. Second, trauma doesn't disappear with time. It compounds, it spreads, and it finds new ways to express itself across generations. Third, justice delayed is often justice denied, but revenge delayed can be absolutely devastating. Look around modern America. Look at families torn apart by political divisions. Look at communities destroyed by economic inequality. Look at children growing up in systems that fail to protect them from violence, poverty, and trauma. Now imagine those children 20 years from now, with adult resources and 20 years of anger. The concubines' children didn't just want individual revenge. They wanted systemic change. They were willing to destroy an entire government to prevent other families from experiencing what they had experienced. That's not just a medieval story. That's a blueprint for how revolutionary movements are born. This story isn't really about medieval Korea. It's about what happens when societies fail to protect their most vulnerable members, and then act surprised when those members grow up seeking revenge. It's about the cost of injustice, the price of unchecked power, and the long-term consequences of short-term cruelty. Most importantly, it's about the fact that children remember everything. They remember who protected them and who failed them. They remember who showed them mercy and who showed them cruelty. And sometimes they grow up to be in positions where they can return the favor. And that, history fam, is how a group of medieval baby mamas brought down an entire dynasty through sheer determination, strategic planning, and generational trauma. If this story of royal revenge, political intrigue, and medieval horror kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. We're trying to hit 100K likes on this video because apparently the YouTube algorithm loves medieval murder mysteries as much as y'all do. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because next week we're diving into another insane historical conspiracy. This time involving Renaissance Italian poison masters, papal politics, and a murder plot that makes today's story look like a children's bedtime story. Drop a comment below and let me know. Do you think the concubines were justified in seeking revenge? Was Queen Noguk a victim of her circumstances or a genuine sociopath? And most importantly, which historical period should we explore next? Remember, history isn't just about dead people doing dead things. It's about understanding the patterns of human behavior that keep repeating across cultures and centuries. The names change, the technology changes, but jealousy, power, revenge, and justice, those are eternal. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember the past is never really past. It's just waiting for the right moment to return.